So Professor Patrick Minford, who will be speaking first, is a professor of applied economics at Cardiff University. He's had a very long and illustrious career spanning the world of government, economics and academia. He started actually overseas, where he was an advisor to the Treasury in Malawi and then moved to Her Majesty's Treasury, being awarded a CBE for services to economics in '96. It's particularly relevant to this debate on the UK and the EU because he's written a lot on, especially in the early 2000s, on why the UK should not join the euro. And I'm sure Patrick has some very interesting thoughts on the current debate. To my left, we have Charles Grant, who's the director of the Centre of European Reform, very well known, one of the leading think tanks on UK-EU relations, and also well known throughout Europe on the future, thinking on the future of how Europe should be constructed. Charles started his career in journalism, spent many years with The Economist, being based in Brussels, reporting then on the European Economic Community, and then later moved to London, where he was the diplomatic editor. He's been recognized by several EU countries, including France and Poland, for his contribution to European and international policy making. And our final panelist is Professor Richard Whitman, who's an associate fellow at the Europe program at Chatham House. He's also the head of the European he was also the head of the European program at Chatham House, and is now the director of the Global Europe Centre and professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent. So with our panel today, we have a wide array of expertise, from the UK-EU relationship to the Eurozone, trade and international relations. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick first.
But I want to start, this is about influence if we're not in Europe. Not in the EU, I should say, because I guess we can't do anything about being in Europe. But Brexit, or as I prefer to call it, Reset, because I think Brexit's a bit dramatic. I think effectively we will always renegotiate relationships with our neighbours, because they're very important to us. And that's my main point on the first point about foreign policy, about which I know very little, though I was born into a diplomatic family and lugged around the world for quite a few years. Nevertheless, I turned to economics as my subject, and so I leave it to my able fellow panelists to talk about foreign policy. But my sort of simple-minded approach on foreign policy is I cannot really see why it makes much difference if we're in an alliance inside the EU or an alliance outside the EU. I imagine we will still be good friends and allies in NATO, in operations in the UN, in operations with Europe, when anyway, even when we're in the EU, we often don't agree with the rest of the EU, and it's all sorts of lobbying and remarks are made about how Her Majesty doesn't quite see eye to eye with the rest. I don't see much difference, to be quite honest, in or out, because I imagine foreign policy will be conducted, as it always is, in a broad Western alliance. Now, let me turn to the other area where I want to say things, which is trade. Now here, as I've said on this slide, the basic point, I'm sure that Charles will elaborate on it, is that if we don't remain as part of the EU, we become marginalized in trade. It's kind of the big story for the pro-EU camp, is this sort of what I call the scare story, really. Now, the thing is that the trade, actually, it's interesting that this should be the focus of the pro-EU camp, that trade is somehow the strong point of staying in the EU, because the big problem is that the EU is actually a highly protectionist organization. I come to this, I move this thing, how am I to do it? Just use the keyboard, okay. If you look at the European Union, it's a customs union. This never seems to be mentioned. We're always told it's a free market, single market arrangement, which is terrifically good for all free marketeers should be in favor of it. Of course, it's well known that it's highly protectionist. In agriculture, the protection rate's about 16%. I'm going to talk about tariff equivalents, not tariffs. Tariffs aren't very important most of the time, though. In the CAP, it's kind of intervention prices that give you effective tariffs. In trade and manufactures, it's also about 16% if you include all these non-tariff barriers, and we have measures of this sort of thing. And this is really the point, that although tariffs in manufacturers are quite unimportant, non-tariff barriers are very important and give you a sort of effective rate of protection of, as I say, about a 16%. So these effects of protection of being inside the European market are very important from a trade point of view in distorting the shape of the economy. What effectively these tariff equivalents do is raise the prices on protected industries and expand those industries relative to the unprotected industries, which of course get damaged by the effects of the protected industries in factor markets, on labour and so forth. And so we've applied a pretty standard 4-block trade model to this problem and asked, well, what's the effect in this model where you have factor markets, labour markets, capital markets, product markets? What's the effect? There are 4 main products in the model. There's manufacturers, there's services, there's agriculture, and there's the non-traded sector. And what happens if you put tariffs on, you join a customs union, a big bloc like the EU, which effectively enforces its own, tariffs, and it creates a barrier around you. And you're a very small part of that whole market. If you leave that, what happens is that prices fall, of course. The first thing that happens is consumer prices fall. According to this computation, we've assumed a 10% trade barrier in both food and manufacturers. These are pretty important commodities in the consumer basket. So when you leave, those prices fall for those sectors by 10%. And of course, the consumer prices fall. Services prices are unprotected in the common market, and what used to be called the common market, fall a bit because, of course, of the general fall in prices. And what happens is that manufacturing contracts and services expand. The net effect of being in the EU is effectively to boost up the manufacturing sector quite substantially compared with the service sector, which is the natural comparative advantage of the UK. Effectively, leaving the EU, one must be quite clear about this, would mean that the manufacturing sector, which would lose quite a substantial amount of protection, would contract, and what you'd be left with was service-type activities, including high-tech manufacturing, which is essentially a service industry. And so, if you think about it, you get this effect, and the main point, which is never really emphasized by people who say trade is such a great thing for the UK's relationship with Europe, is that trade is actually a big negative for our relationship with Europe, costing us something like 4% of national income. Okay, so now let's talk about what it would be like outside the EU. And here, there's a really important principle in trade theory, which is the importance of being unimportant. And the idea is this: we are actually quite a small country in the world market, and in all the industries of the world, what happens if we leave the EU, reset or Brexit, whatever you want to call it, is that we face world prices. We substitute world prices for EU prices, which are distorted, of course, in favor of these protective margins. And as a small country, what happens is that, you don't affect world prices. You take world prices, because this is better than taking EU prices, which distort the structure of the economy. So outside, if you're a small country, what is the effect, you see, of being small? You shouldn't have any tariffs, because tariffs are simply self-harm. They raise the prices of goods to your consumers. And so the best strategy is no tariffs, you see. And so the best strategy for the UK is free trade. And as a matter of fact, other countries have no incentive to put up tariffs on a small country because they won't affect the prices of those products, because you're too small to affect prices. So if you put up tariffs on UK products, this won't have any effect on the prices of the world products that the UK exports. And so the big scare, you see, says that, oh gosh, we'd be in a terrible shape if we leave the EU because, we can't do these trade agreements. We'd be too small, we'd be too insignificant. No one will want to sit down with us because we're such tiddlers. We need to be part of this big fish. And they'll have to deal with the whale, the European whale, and then they'll have to deal with them. The truth is, these trade agreements are totally irrelevant to us outside the EU. Now, I've sat with lawyers on panels like this and had a terrible afternoon. Because, of course, lawyers love trade agreements, and I'm kind of taking away their mess of pottage, and that's awful. But the thing is, there are actually two sorts of trade agreements that we would deal with outside the EU. One is what I call trade agreements with other little fish, and they are irrelevant to us. Let me go to them first and then come back to the big countries. You see, they're irrelevant because what happens if a little Ruritania gives you a tariff concession, you sell more in Ruritania, but they don't affect world prices at all, so you sell less somewhere else. You don't sell any more overall, you simply divert your product to Ruritania from somewhere else, you see. So what a trade agreement with Ruritania means if you're in Brexit is completely meaningless. You sell more one place, you divert the product. So this is pointless to have. So agreements with small countries are irrelevant. Now what about big blocs? Here the problem is, if you have the EU agreement we have is a perfect example of a big bloc agreement, and it's immensely damaging to us. The last thing you want to do is to get into the sort of the surrounding currents of a big bloc, because what will they do? They will make you adopt their priorities. As we've seen, the protection priorities of the EU are damaging to us. You don't want to join a big bloc. What about other blocs? Well, it's kind of the same story. You could kind of get into an agreement with a big country like China or the US and find that you're having your priorities as a global small fish player in the world economy distort priorities so that a whole bunch of new prices are given to you by these guys. You don't want to do it. You don't want to do it. If you're going to do it, you need to look at the fine print. We never looked at the fine print of the EU. Now, 40 years later, we find the fine print doesn't suit us very much. And so I would say, with big blocs, beware Greeks and others bearing gifts. Because the gifts may contain a little bit of poison. Like the gifts that Medea gave Theseus. So, the best UK policy is, really summing up here, unilateral trade, unilateral free trade. Don't let's have any tariffs. Let's actually complete the liberalization of the British economy. See, 40 years ago, the British economy was a terrible mess, and in a great panic, the establishment of this country thought, well, the EU is not such a mess, we better join it. Now we've discovered that actually we can run our own affairs quite well. Free markets do work, we've liberalized, and the ultimate liberalization is actually to go back into the world market, which in those days we didn't think about doing, and, have free trade. And I think I'll leave it there, because that's basically what I want to say.
Thank you. Well, there was lots of furious scribbling, so I'm sure there is a good basis for a debate. I'd like to invite Charles to speak now.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to talk about EU foreign policy, but just a few comments on Patrick Minford's trade arguments, not all of which I claim to understand, but I take issue with a few things. I mean, I agree that tariffs are a very bad idea, and I share his view that fewer tariffs is good for everybody in Britain, even though it might be painful. But you seem to be a little naive in assuming that if Britain leaves the EU, we won't impose any tariffs, have any kind of agricultural policy to protect our farmers. Do you really believe the Tory party would agree to that?
And so something called deficiency payments.
Yeah.
You're a bit too young to remember them.
Right, I do actually remember. I'm older than my look. I do remember deficiency payments, but I just think that the idea that we would have a purely Minford, Thatcher, Lawson economy on the day we leave the EU is a little bit naive in my view. FTAs,
ruin in a nation.
FTAs are irrelevant, you say. Well, Are they relevant to the British exporters whose exports to the Republic of Korea have doubled since the EU's FTA with Korea went into effect? Because they're not irrelevant in my view, I am worried about Britain leaving the EU, because from the day we leave, the 60-odd trade agreements that the EU has negotiated with other bodies and countries will become null and void. Now, we can, of course, renegotiate them bilaterally, and we would try to do so very quickly by hiring old trade negotiators out of retirement and so on to do that. But I think that's quite a task. Anyway, enough on trade. Let me switch to foreign policy, where I believe the EU does amplify and enhance and promote British interests and British values better than Britain can do on its own. I believe that the West, though a very unfashionable concept, is a useful concept. The Western countries and their allies are countries that believe in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. They don't always practice what they preach, but they do more often than those countries that are not part of the West. And I believe the West has had a very bad 10 years. The rise of emerging powers, some of which are democratic but don't believe in applying democracy to their foreign policy, such as Brazil, South Africa and India, is quite alarming for the Western order. Those countries I've just mentioned, though democracies, have not criticised Russia's annexation of Crimea or its military adventures in southeast Ukraine, for example. They did not support Aung San Suu Kyi when she was under house arrest in Burma. And countries like Russia and China, of course, are not democratic at all, and countries like Russia and China believe that their neighbours should not be allowed to have independent foreign policies or criticise them. They believe in spheres of influence. And the EU, for whatever its faults, is an important part of the Western global order, the Western-led global order. If the EU is weak, fragile and fragmenting, what's left is the US and a few countries following in its wake, like Germany, Japan and Britain. But the fact that the EU does exist, and it is an important balance to the US, makes the Western global order less American than it would otherwise be. This is important for global governance, because the Americans are less committed to global governance than are the Europeans. The Europeans put a huge amount into the UN, the international financial organisations, and many other international institutions, the International Criminal Court, arms control treaties and so on, some of which the Americans, the Chinese and the Russians choose not to be involved in. Think of the International Criminal Court, for example. Think of the CT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which the Americans have not ratified, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which they haven't ratified. But the Europeans are there beating the drum for global governance, reminding the Americans that it's in their interests, and sometimes the Americans get the message, particularly on economic issues. So I think that if the EU didn't exist, the West would be much weaker than it is now, and what was left of it would just be the Americans, and I don't think that's in anybody's interest. But we should not forget the EU's role in more conventional foreign policy issues, where sometimes the EU is quite effective, more often than people recognise. Let me just mention very briefly 5 examples. Serbia and Kosovo. Who did the deal that brokered in 2013 between Serbia and Kosovo, through which they settled their differences and agreed to both move closer to the EU? That was Catherine Ashton negotiating on behalf of the EU as the EU's special representative. A very successful settlement and probably a permanent one. Second example is Somalia, not often in the British newspapers, but the EU has actually had a very good example of a joined-up foreign policy in Somalia. There's been a naval force off the coast, which, alongside other forces, has helped to reduce the pirate attacks. The EU has paid for the African Union peacekeeping force that's restored order to Mogadishu. The EU's trained 5,000 local troops and police and boosted the capacity of Somalia's courts and its own navy, and those of Somalia's neighbours as well. So quite successful outcomes in Somalia. Thirdly, the Iranian nuclear programme. This was an EU initiative back in 2002, led by Solana and the British, French and German foreign ministers to try and persuade Iran to abandon its nuclear programme. It's taken 13 or 14 years with lots of stops and starts and hiccups along the way. We've got there. And we only got there because the Americans joined in and became committed to it, and the Russians and the Chinese were actually on that issue quite supportive. But we have got there, and it was the EU sanctions, in particular the SWIFT bank clearing sanctions, that really hurt the Iranians, plus the lack of investment in their oil industry, that helped persuade the Iranians to play the game which, touch wood, they are playing. Fourth example is Burma. The EU had very strong sanctions on Burma, as did the Americans. But the EU, unlike the Americans, can lift sanctions relatively easily. It's almost impossible for Americans to lift sanctions in Congress. And when in 2012 the generals in Burma showed signs of wanting reform, the EU sent a delegation to them to say if the National League for Democracy, that's Aung San Suu Kyi's party, was allowed to contest the elections and if political prisoners were freed, the sanctions would be lifted. The general said, okay, let's do it, and they did it. And Burma's made a hell of a lot of progress since then, though of course we all know there are still problems. A final example is Ukraine, where it's easy to forget that what actually provoked the Maidan protests in late 2013 was Yanukovych's decision to reject an EU deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine that would have opened up the EU's markets much more quickly than it would have opened up Ukraine's markets. And people didn't like that. And since then, although the EU is not a major diplomatic player in the Minsk process, it is a hugely important player when it comes to the sanctions on Russia, which are much stronger than the Russians thought they'd be. They're much stronger than the Americans thought they'd be. The sanctions on limiting the ability of Russian companies to raise money in international markets are in fact really quite effective, and they are, as Putin himself admitted within the last 2 days, they are damaging the Russian economy. He wants them lifted, which is why Russia has told its agents on the ground in the Donbass to calm down. In the last 3 or 4 months there's been quite a lot less fighting. That is partly because Putin wants the sanctions lifted. So those are just some examples of the EU doing good in the world, fulfilling British objectives, which Britain on its own would not be able to achieve, in my view. And just a final thought or two. I do think that it's easy enough to forget what the EU was set up to do. It has brought peace and stability to its own members in much of the European continent. The enlargement of the European Union, I have heard Eurosceptics like Liam Fox and Michael Gove admit, has been a fantastically good thing for the people living in Central and Eastern Europe. It has forced the people in those, forced the governments of those countries to adopt rule of law, better governance, independent judiciaries and so on. Now there is of course always a bit of backsliding. There's been some backsliding in Hungary. The Commission's put pressure on Hungary to get its act together with some results. I would have liked stronger pressure. Now we've got some issues in Poland that are certainly important, but certainly the impact of the EU on Central and Eastern Europe has been, I think, very positive indeed. I think I'll just finish by saying that we shouldn't forget what the West is, that the EU shares with the Americans most of, and the Japanese and Australians and many others, most of the West's beliefs in a rules-based global order. And the trouble with Russia and China is they do not believe in a rules-based global order. If you are a neighbour of Russia or China, you know that they want to bully you into doing what they want you to do. And the fact that the annexation of Crimea was illegal is irrelevant to many people in Russia because they think we're big and strong and we have historical links, so stuff international law, it's ours. And if you talk to Chinese government people about the islets in the South China Sea that they claim, they have exactly the same line. They don't care what the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague says about the case that the Philippines has taken there. They think we're big and strong and we're a superpower, we'll take what we want. And you know that kind of rule, that is going very much against the rules-based global order that Europeans believe in and Americans believe in on a good day. And if the EU is weakened by the departure of Britain, it'll be very bad news for the rules-based global order. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to hand over to Richard now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and to tackle what I think is a very difficult examination question, whether we use a multiplier or nullifier of the UK's international influence. Because unlike some of the topics that we've taken a look at today, I think the body of systematically organised evidence in this area is rather thinner, shall we say, particularly outside the issues of political economy or foreign economic policy. And what's tended to attract attention has been more the sort of public pronouncements, particularly Obama's statement in July last year that remaining an EU member is the best strategy for the UK to have international influence, for example. In fact, it's really difficult to find counter examples of that, of international leaders advocating the UK's exit from the EU. Mr. Putin's name is often taken in vain here, but I've searched desperately for a quote where he has said that he wants the UK to leave the EU, but I think it's more a case of guilty by association or guilt by act. And of course, one of the reasons why it's pretty tough to assess what the impact might be is the obvious point that we've got no precedent, and therefore we haven't really got a framework or an organising set of arrangements to try and come up with a sort of balance sheet. The best we've got, I think, is the Balance of Competences report that was produced under the previous coalition government, and the foreign and development policy parts of that overall study, which I think are the only real systematic studies to date, I think, of the costs and benefits. And of course we've got the ongoing inquiry on cost and benefits of the UK's role in the world, which the House Common Foreign Affairs Committee is undertaking at the moment, and Charles has given evidence to, but I promise not to use any of his words back against him this afternoon. But what's interesting, I think, about the Balance of Competences report is, of course, it was an open call for evidence, and based on that open call, the summary was that it was generally strongly in the UK's interest to work through the EU foreign policy. The argument being to sort of tweet it rather than rehearse the whole argument is it was a consequence of increased impact and influence that comes from acting in concert, which I think is part of the argument that Charles was making. Of course, associated with that, I think, is an argument, one that's certainly replayed in most international relations analysis of UK exit from the EU, is that we're going against the trend of post-Second World War international relations, which has generally been in the direction of integration, institutionalisation within Europe, and particularly through the sponsorship of the processes or dual process of enlargement for the EU and NATO. So, in the absence of a sort of decent body of evidence that we could kick around, what have we got? Well, if we look at the sort of the think tank commentariat debate so far in the sort of phony war phase of the Brexit referendum, I think at the extremes we're having two scenarios being painted. The first one, which I think fits with the idea that the UK, the EU provides a multiplier for the EU's foreign policy, is that any Brexit would trigger some kind of Titanic scenario in which there'd be a broader diplomatic crisis for the UK, and the UK would have to work extremely hard to counter the view that its international role, influence and significance was being diminished. The opposite extreme, if you see these as a continuum, this is the nullifier view, the idea that the EU gets in the way of UK foreign and security policy, is a view we heard rehearsed this morning from Lord Lawson, which is what I call a sort of liberation or phoenix scenario. You know, that it would allow the UK, no longer an EU member, to free up diplomatic and political bandwidth from the encumbrances of the EU's sort of decision-making diplomatic processes, to allow for recalibration of the UK's interests in the world, and to draw on, again, as we heard this morning, the sort of resources of soft power, the city, the Anglosphere, the Commonwealth, and to sort of seek out new relationships with the rising powers. And of course, for both of these positions and those in between, there's the very interesting question of the attitude of the US, having sort of so publicly expressed a preference for where it would like the UK to stay, how the US would respond to any shift outside of the UK on the part of the EU. If you look at the sort of arguments for multiplying, and there's a balance of competence and some of the evidence which has been given in the Foreign Affairs Committee inquiry, the argument goes along these lines, that the engagement with the EU's foreign policy making process acts as a kind of multiplier. It allows for a way of working to act collaboratively and to leverage the common resources of all of the member states for diplomatic advantage. And that alongside that the process of European integration is given or provided a platform or a context in which you've had an unparalleled period of peaceful relationships between the UK and its neighbours. And more than that, it's allowed a sort of very effective transition from what otherwise would be a difficult moment in Europe's international relations, which is the transition from the Cold War into a sort of post-Cold War era. And on the top of that, the argument tends to be that there are a number of effects that would come if the UK disengaged from EU foreign policy. The first would be what I characterise as sort of stepping off the edge of a cliff. You know, the EU foreign policy has provided an organising framework, or the UK's relationship with the EU has provided an organising framework since 1973. And so you're opening up some of the uncertainties that Charles has already touched on. Secondly, that the EU is a very efficient organisation for doing diplomatic business. It allows you to make decisions across or with a substantial number of other European countries to facilitate the resolution of interstate agreements, disagreements rather, and to iron out all kinds of differences to allow for collective and common positions which then in turn serve a common interest. That there be a loss of influence, that the UK would no longer have sort of leverage effects that it does at the moment, and worse than that, it would allow a whole series of issues that the UK has held the line on, for example in the defence areas like the operational headquarters for the CSDP or expansion of the EDA. All of those would then become much more problematic for the UK if a European defence arrangement was to develop in a way that sat less well as the UK see it with the EU. And on top, that there would be a sort of trigger or potential trigger for national disintegration, which has been touched on this morning with Scottish independence, and also the impact on Northern Ireland, the relationship with the Irish Republic in general. So all of those, are pretty, I think, a pretty compelling set of arguments as to the sort of foreign policy costs that would come to the UK of exiting from the EU. But there is also the argument that there would, of course, be costs to the EU. And these would be that UK exit would in and of itself trigger a crisis in perceptions of the EU, trigger a crisis in terms of its standing within international relations. That there would be a loss of the heft that the UK currently lends to the EU in terms of its capacity, its national capacity for foreign security and defence policy, which has a collective benefit for all the other member states. You also lose the UK's influence in sort of keeping the common foreign security policy, the common security and defence policy, member state sensitive in terms of the British perspective, in terms of keeping a sort of sensitivity to the preservation of national room for manoeuvre with foreign security and defence policy. And it was also changed the dynamic on defence with the UK out, not just the UK's capabilities, but the UK's sort of long-standing position on the ways in which European security and defence policy should develop, which reads largely for civilian conflict and crisis management. Then that would then open up some of the issues that have been tabled in the past, which will allow for the defence moving in another direction, which the UK may well see as being fits less with its interests in terms of NATO and the development of NATO as an organisation. And as an aside, I haven't really got time to touch on that. There's a whole set of issues around development policy, both in particular around the loss of UK voice, the position that the UK has taken in terms of the way in which EU development policy has unfolded over recent years. Where the foreign security and defence policy debate is likely to go once we crank up the referendum campaign, as we saw from the Cameron speech in November, he'd like us to talk a lot about the foreign, or rather security benefits of EU membership. So I think we could probably anticipate that there will be more of a discussion on those kind of broad interests. I suspect there'll be much less discussion on the specifics of CSDP, apart from those who are nerds or train spotters who are interested in CSDP missions and the UK contribution or not. But I think one thing we could be sure about is that whether there is a Brexit or not, the UK's foreign and security policy is going to remain entwined with the successes and failures of the EU anyway. So even if there is a decision to lose, it will still remain front and centre, I think, in a post-Brexit UK foreign security policy.
Thank you.
Cosmetics. Everyone around the world uses cosmetic directives.
There are an awful lot of industries. Can I reply?
Yes.
No, I haven't gone through them yet.
No, but
these are
quite
the
boring.
main UK export industries.
Quite boring.
You have no room.
You're missing the point totally. You're missing the point totally. It's not about these world regulative bodies. Of course, we would become a member of them in our own right. But the point is that it's about the particular trade and non-tariff barriers erected by the EU, which have nothing to do with these bodies.
Of course they do.
No, they don't. They are EU choices. There is an EU policy. The EU is responsible for our trade and tariff barriers.
Let me give you an example. The EU was criticised for non-tariff barriers by the rest of the world car industry on a variety of things, because the EU has higher car regulation. It has had since the 70s. And this has been criticised time and time again by US and Japan manufacturers, largely for ecological and safety motivations. Over time, what happened with these so-called non-tariff barriers, in trade terms, were that UN bodies began adapting them. And so these things, which were non-tariff barriers for economists, were regulatory standards for everyone else. They are the same thing, just looked through different perspectives. Now, if you want to sell your car anywhere else, you have, not just the EU, but in the US or Japan, you now have to follow UN ECE standards. You will not be able to sell your car on it, and they comply with them. That was once upon a time you can call a non-tariff barrier. It is now the regulatory standard for world trade.
Okay. Do you want to respond to that, or should we
Well,
take
not
the next
particularly,
question?
because, it's an idiotic remark, if I may say so, because there is such a thing as EU non-tariff barriers. So what do you imagine the agreement with Japan was on the restriction of Japanese entry into from Japan of cars made back in 20-odd years ago? What do you think anti-dumping duties are? They're nothing to do with regulation. They're anti-dumping duties. And they are anti-dumping duties. So what it is obviously, if you want to say everything the EU does is something that's been mandated by international bodies, you're free to do so. Or if you want to say that it's all about regulation and there's nothing else that is a non-tariff barrier, you're free to do so. But it's manifest nonsense, because the point is, what we identify in the data is that the prices of these goods in the EU are different from those that would prevail in world markets. That is the acid test. And so there's clearly a whole range of things that any big bloc does to regulate the access of other countries to their markets, and thereby to change the prices at which they sell inside. The prices of cars in the EU are higher than world prices. That's all I need to show you.
Let's just agree to disagree on this point.
Well, I think, as I think somebody said a moment ago, Richard said this, there's no other country has actually said it would like the EU to leave. I mean, we kind of think that Putin probably does, but we can't prove it. He cleverly hasn't allowed himself to be tape recorded saying that yet. I spent quite a lot of time in Washington, and apart from the sort of wilder fringes of the Republican Party, there is unanimity across the political class of the US that it would be very bad for the US and US interests if Britain left, because the US, as de Gaulle rightly said, the UK, as de Gaulle rightly said, is sometimes a Trojan horse for US interests in Europe. It relies on the UK to promote what it wants, particularly to steer the EU in a less protectionist direction, to steer it towards a more strategic and firmer foreign policy, as, for example, the UK has done on sanctions on Russia vis-à-vis Ukraine. So I think there's quite a strong view also in Washington that EU defence policy is actually a very good idea. I mean, initially when it was invented by Blair and Chirac in 1998, there was a lot of worry in Washington about it. But the worry now is not that there's too much EU defence policy, the worry is there's too little, that European defence is too weak. And the US thinks that Europe ought to do more to defend itself because it has other preoccupations in Asia and the Middle East, and it's very concerned about levels of defence spending in Europe, and it wants a strong European defence. And it knows that thanks to the British, that's compatible with NATO. The British have always ensured that EU defence doesn't undermine or damage NATO, and if the British leave the EU and US EU defence becomes this purely Polish, French, German-led phenomenon, then there's a real risk that EU defence could develop in ways that would undermine NATO. So I think the Americans have very clear views. But also, finally, the whole question of the German question. I mean, the Americans understand geopolitics rather better than most Europeans do, and they understand that There's a problem in Europe, which is Germany runs Europe in many ways, and it's not very good for Germany, it's not very good for the rest of Europe either. And if Britain leaves the EU, that will create all sorts of insecurities, stresses and strains and worries, particularly in places like Paris and Rome, that about the preponderance of German power. It'll create quite a lot of worries in Germany too. And the Americans get all that in a way that a lot of people in Britain don't.
So you would see that rather than a balkanization of foreign affairs and no integration, but rather German.
Well, I think just to finish to answer that long question, yeah, I mean, EU foreign policy would be much weaker without the British, because the British are serious players with global interests and global knowledge and expertise, at least some of the time on some issues. And without the Brits, EU foreign policy would be taken less seriously and less credibly by China, Russia, India, the US and other players. And the EU defence policy would become much more bureaucratic and institutional, rather less focused on capabilities and doing things, which is the way the British have tried to push it.
If you look at perceptions, I think there's more and more work being done, and I know there's a lot of work planned in terms of sort of other member state perceptions of the impact of Brexit on the EU's place in the world. Then that suggests that the views are generally that it would have a significant negative impact. And if you look at things like Pew studies, which have looked at sort of perceptions of the EU, the EU started to take its mood out of the dip that it's had, Brexit and so on, is now simply climbing out of that. But you can imagine it might take a bit of a nosedive straight after any decision on Brexit. I mean, I think it's interesting that where you've had governments which have been the most willing to stick their necks out has been closer to home rather than farther away, particularly Ireland, but also obviously Norway has been very clear in terms of the advice that's offered to the UK. And if you look at things like sort of views from Commonwealth member states and so on, I mean, it's very difficult to find any enthusiasm, even at the margin, for the idea that there might be a new kind of relationship that might be found with the UK as a consequence of the Brexit. So, I mean, I think that clearly the sort of systemic effects would be grim, certainly in terms of perceptions, and almost certainly in terms of the perception of the EU's capabilities. And I think the neighbourhood effects would be dire, frankly.
It's really Bree said that the fundamentals haven't changed. All that's happened is we've moved out of one room. By the way, foreign policy isn't even in the treaty.
Yes, it is.
It is not regulated in the treaty. We don't have to do stuff it's in the treaty, of course, because we're part of now something that's become an enormous kind of empire, really. But, actually, originally this was the European Economic Union, and all the regulations on the economic side. There is indeed some cooperation in the treaty, and and foreign policy. But, the fact is, if you look at when we try to analyze these things scientifically, there's no change in the external circumstances. All there is we've moved out of one room into another room next door, and we can still talk. So I just think this is massive over-dramatization by a bunch of guys who study international relations, which is a great subject, but seems to have no scientific basis. The situation we're in today is very different from the one in which we joined. And so I think my answer to your question is, well, as I said to Charles earlier, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. I'm not going to say that we'll do everything by the liberal free market book, but I think the majority of our policies will be guided by that because people have seen that that's what benefits them. And so I think that, levying tariffs on countries that supply us goods that we want is something consumers would not favour. They'd see the point.
But you would say that still, even in the context of, seeing things like the biggest kind of grassroots opposition to TTIP has actually been in Germany and this country, and also taking into account having a fairly liberal migration policy, which has obviously been a toxic political question.
Well, I didn't talk about migration because I think migration is most countries in the world have policies towards migration, so what you might call green card policies in broad terms. In Australia, America, Canada, they all have these policies. And I would regard that as a reasonably liberal policy that kind of treats everybody from all countries that aren't in your country the same. And basically gives kind of like a scale of, you can't let everybody into a country. After all, everybody can accept that. So there has to be some migration policy. And the idea that, you know, it's perfectly okay to let anybody from Europe come in without any let or hindrance, but to keep everybody else kind of pretty tightly controlled, doesn't really seem to me to make a lot of sense. And so I think that actually this would be a logical extension of a liberal policy. We would have a rational policy towards migration from all comers.
Any of the panelists like to comment
Well,
on?
perhaps just pick up a couple of the things that Patrick said. As I'm sure he's aware, the OECD publishes rankings of how liberal the developed countries are. Things
They're in
like
my
labour
book.
markets.
They're in my book. You can read them.
And well, you'll know then, Patrick, that Britain is amongst the most economically liberal countries in the OECD, sometimes with the New Zealand and the Dutch. But we're in the EU.
In spite of it, we've managed to...
Isn't it interesting that all these dreadful rules and regulations from Brussels, these horrible non-tariff barriers, and these awful regulations, actually, OECD says Britain has a very deregulated economy, relatively speaking, compared to many other developed countries. On the trade point...
We've managed to fend off quite a lot of these things. You can read my book on this, Charles.
Yeah, well, I can listen to you. It's such a pleasure. I don't need to read the book.
If you look at it, the EU managed to win for a time, and then we managed to get back, more or less, by a variety of tricks, which will probably be exterminated by the EU in due course.
One of your theses earlier on, Patrick, was that if Britain abolishes all its tariffs and non-tariff barriers, our trading partners will not seek to impose tariffs on us because our economy is rather small. That's one of the points you made, relatively speaking.
I said they had no incentive. I'm not saying they won't. It doesn't matter. Okay. I said it didn't matter.
Okay, well, I just think if you talk to the French car industry, I cannot believe that the French car industry would not want to impose EU tariffs on British automobile parts, components and cars if Britain leaves the EU, because it would be in the interest of the French car industry to protect itself in that way.
I'm assuming they do it.
Oh, okay. And as have you? I don't know if you've ever spoken to the Scottish Whisky Association, but they will give you chapter and verse on how in many countries like Japan in the past, India in the future, they rely on the EU to negotiate on behalf of the UK to open up markets for their whisky, because the EU as a whole has more clout than little UK, which is, as you say, quite small, and more things it can trade off with the Japanese, the Indians, the Chinese, or whoever. So the SWA, the Scottish Whisky Association, certainly believes that being part of a bigger club is beneficial for their export prospects.
Okay, I think we are going to have to wrap up the conversation here. We obviously still have a lot to discuss. We've only scratched the surface.